So picture this, it's 2015 and public health officials in Beijing are dealing with a really concerning trend. HIV infections were spiking inside a specific community, and they absolutely had to figure out why and fast. Today, we're going to break down the study that uncovered some pretty alarming answers. To really get into this research, you first have to understand the urgent problem that officials in Beijing were staring down at the time. And this was the heart of the issue. Infections were just surging among men who have sex with men, or MSM. By 2011, the data was showing that this had become the #1 way new HIV cases were spreading in the city. The numbers weren't just high, they were climbing at a scary pace, and officials needed to know exactly what was going on. Look, when you're facing a potential epidemic, you can't just guess. You need cold, hard data. So a team of researchers kicked off a really detailed investigation to get a crystal clear picture of what was happening on the ground. So how in the world do you track an epidemic, especially within a community that can sometimes be pretty hard to reach? Well, the answer lies in a very specific and methodical research plan. They used something called an Open Cohort Study. Now, I know that sounds super technical, but the idea is actually pretty simple. You just follow a group of people over a period of time to see who gets infected. And the open part, that just means new people could join along the way, which really helps keep the data robust. And this process was incredibly thorough. Kicking off in September 2009, they signed up over 1,000 HIV-negative men. Then, for the next 31 months, that's more than 2.5 years, they did regular interviews and lab tests. This wasn't random. This systematic approach was designed to figure out not just if someone got infected, but to find the patterns that could explain why. Okay, so after all that painstaking work, what did the numbers actually show? Well, what they found was, to put it mildly, pretty disturbing. The big headline number for HIV was an incidence rate of 5.9 per 100 person years. Now, person years is just a scientific way to measure risk over time. Here's an easy way to think about it. If you followed 100 people for exactly 1 year, this rate suggests that about 6 of them would likely contract HIV. The study itself called this a drastic increase compared to what they'd seen before. But that wasn't the only thing they were tracking. They were also looking at syphilis, another STI. And here, the rate was actually higher, 7.8 new cases per 100 person years. So at first glance, you might think, wow, syphilis is the bigger problem here. But the real story wasn't just in the numbers themselves. It was in the trend, the direction they were heading. Yeah, the syphilis rate was high, but it was either holding steady or even going down a bit. The HIV rate, on the other hand, was on a sharp, dangerous upward climb. These were two totally different stories unfolding at the exact same time. A rising infection rate is like a fire alarm going off. But to fight the fire, you have to know what started it. So the researchers had to dig deep into all the behavioral data they collected to find these specific things that were putting people at risk. And their analysis pointed to 3 major factors. Having sex after drinking alcohol, that nearly doubled a person's risk. Unprotected anal sex, that increased the risk by about 2.1 times. But look at this last one, it was the real bombshell. Having had a previous STI infection made someone a staggering 4.6 times more likely to acquire HIV. This was just a critical link because other STIs can cause things like sores and inflammation, which basically create an easier doorway for the HIV virus to get into the body. Now, all this data, it wasn't just for a scientific paper. The whole point of the study was to find real evidence that could be used to save lives. So, what were the big lessons for public health officials? The study basically handed them a clear roadmap with 4 huge takeaways. First, this epidemic was incredibly serious and needed immediate action. Second, they identified exactly who needed the most help: younger guys, migrants, and men with less education. Third, there was a huge awareness gap. People just weren't connecting the dots between STIs, alcohol, and HIV risk. And finally, here's the really sobering part. The people who were at the highest risk were also the most likely to drop out of the study. That means the real infection rate out there was probably even higher than what they found. And that brings us to a final, really important question for all of us. This data from back in 2012 gave a clear warning and pointed a spotlight on exactly who is most vulnerable. It really forces us to ask, how can our health systems today get better at being proactive, at reaching and protecting at-risk groups before a crisis explodes? It's a challenge that is just as critical now as it was then. Thanks for tuning in for this deep dive.